fundamental changes in the way that we've approached spending in this country. If we don't, our future commitments and our ever-growing demand for government services will simply devour our economy. But if we do make the tough choices, and you'll see today they really are tough choices, then we can put our country back on track so that future generations will be able to enjoy something that every American generation has enjoyed so far. And that is a better quality of life than the generation that preceded it. By bringing together experts from across the political spectrum, the Fiscal Wake Up Tour demonstrates the only approach that will enable us to meet those challenges. The economic crisis, these tough choices that we're going to face, do not call for trying to seek partisan advantage, but instead to find nonpartisan solutions. And that is exactly what the Fiscal Wake Up Tour is helping us to do. With these thoughts in mind, I'd like to just say a few words about the four excellent panelists who are joining us today. Bob Bixby, better known here as Nancy's cousin, is also the executive director of the Concord Coalition, and he's one of the organizers of the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. He's dedicated much of his life to educating the public about the federal budget and the consequences for future generations. Stuart Butler of the Heritage Foundation has also played a key role in the success of the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. He's helped to shape the public policy debate on a wide range of issues, ranging from healthcare and Social Security to welfare reform. Will Marshall is the president and the founder of the Progressive Policy Institute. He is well respected as an individual who brings a thoughtful, progressive approach to public policy challenges. And finally, I'm very pleased to have someone here today with whom I've worked so closely in Washington, and that is David Walker. David is the former Comptroller General of the United States. That means that he heads the GAO, or headed the GAO. When I was the chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, I think David testified before us more often than any other witness because the breadth of his knowledge is truly extraordinary. And I want to tell you that he is a person ahead of his time when it comes to talking about the fiscal challenges of our country. He was sounding the alarm about excessive government spending and obligations, even at a time when our economy was soaring and the government was very temporarily running surpluses. He brings unparalleled experience and expertise to these issues. It's an honor to join the panelists today for our discussion. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time on a lovely summer day, we haven't had very many of those this summer, to come and talk about issues that are truly critical to our country's future. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Senator Collins. It really is terrific to see so many people come out for an event like this on such a nice day. See, I told you they would. Nancy is my favorite female cousin on my father's side of the family, just for the record. Do we have any Red Sox fans in the audience? I thought maybe we would. Perhaps some of you remember the Impossible Dream from 1967. I do too. I sometimes feel as a member of the Fiscal wake-up tour team that I'm living in something of an impossible dream environment myself. Unfortunately, if the fiscal situation we find ourselves in seems impossible, it isn't a dream. It's all too real. As Senator Collins mentioned, new numbers were released today. But what an extraordinary factoid. We ran a budget deficit last month of $180 billion, which was more than the entire budget deficit was for all of 2007. So things are ramping up rather quickly. One of the other ways to describe this is to measure the budget deficit as a share of the economy, as a share of GDP. This year's budget deficit is going to be roughly twice the previous post-World War II record high, going to around 12, a little over 11, from 6% of GDP. So we truly are in a big mess at the moment. However, it's really important to remember that despite the big headline numbers that you'll see for today's, this year's deficit and next year's deficit, we've been doing this fiscal wake-up tour since 2005, before there was a recession and the efforts to combat the credit crisis, spiked the budget deficit. Even before we got into the problems we're in now, we had an unsustainable situation over the longer term. And that's one of the most important things about the numbers when you look at them today and when you look at the numbers that were released in Washington today. Even after the temporary factors fade, like war and recession, the things that have traditionally caused deficits, we're going to have a very large and unacceptably high budget deficit, and it's on an unsustainable track. So what I'm going to do is sort of set the stage by talking about a little of the budget dynamics that drive this process, and then other speakers will pick up what the implications are for the future. Okay, right now, 3 programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, they're sometimes referred to as the Big 3 entitlement programs, consume about 42% of the federal budget once you subtract the one-time items like for the TARP money and some of the bailout money that just appeared suddenly this year and is going to go away. These 3 programs are already a substantial part of the budget, and the baby boomers, remember, have just begun to qualify for Social Security, haven't begun to qualify for Medicare yet. The programs run on autopilot. That is, they're not addressed, they're not appropriated annually every year. They run based on benefit formulas. And so one of the things that we need to think about with these programs is what's driving the growth. Well, one of them is demographics. We know that the population is projected to age as the boomers begin to retire and people are living longer. So over the next 25 years or so, the percentage of the population age 65 and over is going to go from about 13%, where it is now, to around 20%. And that alone is going to put a lot of pressure on programs like Social Security and Medicare. However, demographics alone is not the only problem. Another problem that we're hearing a lot about this year is rising healthcare costs. Healthcare costs have traditionally grown at a faster rate than our economy, and so they've been taking up a greater share of the economy and a greater share of the federal budget. If you don't bend the curve, as they say, that growth line, eventually healthcare costs take over the entire federal budget. Obviously, that's not going to happen, but that begs the question, what will happen to restrain the growth of healthcare spending? So demographics and healthcare costs are very important. Other speakers will talk about where they go from here, but what I want to do is just drop back and look at the federal budget, where it is today. Now this is a projection that was made in March for the end of the fiscal year, which is coming up in September. And the number is a little bit different because we got new numbers out today, but basically the trend line looks the same. One thing I'd like to point out is the net interest, the top number on the spending column, $170 billion. That's what we spend on interest on the national credit card, in effect. It's a lot of money. To put it in perspective, it's about what we were spending on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's not a small amount of money. And of course, as you run more debt, you take on more interest payments. And one thing to keep in mind is we're borrowing money at low interest costs now. So the federal government could be on the hook for a lot higher interest costs once interest rates begin to go up. As a percentage of the economy, we tend to spend at the federal level at around 21% of the economy and tax a little over 18%. So that means that we tend to run deficits. Just for context, keep in mind when other speakers are talking that the traditional rate has been spending around 21 and taxing around 18, because those trend lines are going to change, and that's part of our problem. So when you borrow all this money, what happens? Well, where do we get the money from? Increasingly, we're borrowing it from foreign lenders. Roughly 50% of our publicly owned debt right now is held by foreign lenders. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it does provide a certain vulnerability should they demand higher interest rates or get spooked about whether we're going to get our acting together. And it also acts as a growing mortgage on future national income because the benefit of that investment flows abroad and not here. I mentioned interest cost is going to really spike if we don't change course, even within the next 10 years. The latest numbers show that interest cost, I said about 170 billion last year, they could go to around 800 billion within 10 years. Just to give you some perspective, that would be as much as we're spending on national defense at that time. So if you can imagine that sort of a situation, spending as much on interest payments as we are on national defense. So that's where the fiscal wake-up tour comes in. We're not spreading gloom and doom. We're spreading an alarm like Paul Revere, in the hope that people will take the corrective actions that need to be taken. Points of agreement on the fiscal wake-up tour. We don't all agree on the right spending level, the right taxing level, the right level of debt. We come from different perspectives on that. But we all agree that the current fiscal policy is unsustainable. It's not ideology, it's arithmetic. We all agree that there aren't any easy solutions like cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, or growing our way out of it. We should cut waste, fraud, and abuse from the budget. We should do everything we can to grow the economy, but we're into a situation where things have gone rather beyond what those cures would fix. We're going to have to find bipartisan cooperation to solve these problems. We're going to have to go back to my charts instead of Dave. We're going to get carried away, and we're going to require public engagement, as Senator Collins said. And finally, this really isn't a numbers issue. Fundamentally, it's a moral issue about the legacy that we're leaving to future generations, and that's why we need to do something about it sooner rather than later. Now, the next speaker has been, as Collins said, has been doing this for a while. Dave Walker has been referred to as the rock star of the fiscal wake-up tour. Any accountant would love to be referred to as a rock star, and Dave likes it too. So and it is true. So I will give you the rock star of the fiscal wake-up tour, David Walker.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks all of you for coming. And Senator Collins, it's an honor and pleasure to be with you. Thanks again for your kind remarks. First, I'm a political independent, like 40% of Mainlanders. We need nonpartisan solutions, not bipartisan solutions. Secondly, on my lapel you have a rosette. It's the Sons of the American Revolution, of which I'm an officer, and certified public accountant. What does that mean? I'm a patriot who can add. Susan Collins is too, but we need more of them in Washington. Let me, if I can, explain to you where we've been, where we are, where we're headed, and briefly what we need to do. The budget has changed dramatically in the last 40 years. From being dominated by defense in 1968, where it was 46%, to now being dominated by social insurance programs, while important, eating up more and more of the budget. The past cannot be prolonged. 40 years ago, when Congress, your elected officials, came to Washington, they got to decide how 2/3 of the budget would be spent. Last year, less than 40%. The rest was on autopilot. And guess what? Those of you like myself who are constitutional scholars will find out that every expressed and enumerated responsibility envisioned by the founders of the Constitution are in discretionary spending, and that's what's getting squeezed. The real problem is not today's deficits and debt levels, although they're a problem. It's the huge off-balance sheet obligations that this country has that have skyrocketed in the last few years. The total liabilities and unfunded promises for Medicare and Social Security alone have gone up from $20 trillion, and there's 12 zeros to the right of that 20 without any pennies, to $56 trillion in 8 years. And it goes up about $3 trillion a year on autopilot with a balanced budget, and we're a long way away from a balanced budget, and without expanding government entitlements. Now, how much is $56 trillion? That's what the number was as of last September 30. It's $184,000 per person. No wonder newborn babies cry. It's $483,000 per household. Believe it or not, while I'm sure that this crowd has an above-average household income, median household income in America is $50,000. That means on our status quo do-nothing path, the typical American household has a second or third mortgage that they don't know about, equal to about 9 or 10 times their income, but no house to back the mortgage. This is the future. If we tax at historical levels, if we don't reform social insurance programs, if the rest of government grows at the rate of the economy, and if we charge the national credit card, which doesn't have a debt limit that we know of because our foreign lenders haven't told us what it is yet. And it shows you that the fastest growing cost is interest, and that's without an interest rate increase. And I'm here to tell you, they're going up. The question is how much, how fast, once we turn the corner on the economy. This is the hockey stick graphic. If you can envision turning it on its head, or not, turning on the side, you can see that this is debt as a percentage of our economy from 1800 going forward to 2050. The problem is not the past, the problem is not the present, the problem is where we're headed. This is a tsunami of debt that could swamp our ship of state. And we don't no longer owe it to ourselves. At the end of World War II, as you'll see in this, the highest debt to GDP we've ever had was 122%, but let me tell you what was fundamentally different. We owed it all to Americans. Americans bought war bonds, Americans saved, Americans invested in our future, and therefore those debt payments stayed in our country. But now, actually, it's a little bit over half. I haven't updated the number. A little bit over half of our debt held by the public is held by foreign lenders. That is not our economic, national security, foreign policy, or even domestic tranquility interest over time. It is a problem. You must pay attention to your bankers. Our bankers have already demanded that the United States Treasury stand behind Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt, even though it was not guaranteed by the federal government. That put us, the taxpayers, on the hook for another $5 trillion. Our bankers are already demanding that we issue more Treasury index securities because they're concerned about inflation. Yes, we can reform our budget controls and bring back the controls that help to take us from large and growing deficits to large and growing surpluses, but they expired at the end of 2002, and Washington has been totally out of control since then. Yes, we can reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, and secure, more savings-oriented. It's a layup. It's not hard. Although how you go about it matters. Yes, we can be able to address healthcare costs by changing our payment systems and leveraging technology, etc., to be able to reduce the rate of increase in healthcare costs without bankrupting America. By better targeting our taxpayer preferences and taxpayer subsidies that are those that are in need, rather than have middle and upper income welfare. Yes, we can have some level of universal health care coverage for things like wellness and catastrophic, with options for people to have more than that. But you cannot reduce costs by expanding coverage. That is an oxymoron. You cannot reduce costs by expanding coverage. First things first. We must get costs under control because it threatens to bankrupt America. Yes, we can reform our tax system to make it more understandable, equitable, competitive, and generate enough revenue to pay our bills and deliver on the promises we intend to keep. We're short now. We're going to be a lot shorter as time goes on, something that doesn't get it. Let me tell you here now, taxes are going up, and they're going up on a lot more people than those making $250,000 or more. Why? A simple word, math. Math, it's a stubborn word. The fact is that you have to do it on a much broader basis, no matter what they tell you from wherever it is, they're going up. And the longer we wait, and you don't raise taxes during the recession, the longer we wait, the higher they're going, for three reasons. Here's that stubborn word again, math. Number two, demographics. And number three, relative degree of political activism by different age groups. But we need to be able to re-engineer the base of government, and we need a fiscal future commission to engage the American people, to tell them the truth, to listen to them, and to come up with a package of recommendations that will be guaranteed a vote in Congress. And Senator Lieberman and Senator Voinovich have legislation to do that. This is not just about numbers. I can give you all kinds of big and bad numbers, and they're getting worse as we find out over time, as we found out today. Down somewhat from projected for this year, but up significantly over the next 10 years as compared to the last projection. It's a moral issue. This is immoral, it's un-American. We are passing the check to our children and grandchildren and reducing their investments in the future. And here's what it's about to me. These are my three grandchildren. They did not create this problem. This is their problem. They don't have a voice. They're too young to vote. Their granddaddy is their voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm from Britain originally. So you can see that I felt a little bit, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable when Paul Bixby describes us as Paul Revere's. But I also have to tell you that I was actually back in Britain last week, and some of my cousins I hadn't met for a long time told me I really sounded like a New Englander. I just want to tell you that I think that was a compliment. So let me take off where we just completed and just talk about mainly the options that we actually have, the choices that we actually have. And let me just start really where Dave left off and where others have spoken about the situation we currently have. We have a tsunami wave of entitlement spending coming through the economy way into the future. We have taxes as a proportion of GDP of our economy of around 18 to 19% for many, many decades. So if we were to try to keep that and move forward at that level, and the tsunami came forward, you've got a bit of a problem. Basically, everything else in government has to disappear. The entire military, never mind get out of Iraq, get out of everywhere. All our education, roads, everything would have to disappear for that to be a possibility. That's what we're looking at, assuming that we see taxes at the current level. Let's just now move very quickly to the current situation. In other words, if you actually look at what the current projections are in the future, you'll see that we actually face at the moment, under current law, taxes going up, actually to record levels over the next 2 or 3 decades. The taxes are built in as going up in the current law. And then we see huge increases in spending because of the combination of these entitlements plus existing spending on these other areas. Given this situation, you've got some choices. Choice one, which is a good American choice, is to do nothing. If you do nothing, as you've seen, and Dave has explained, you see staggering deficits in the future. We've got staggering deficits right now, but if a child born today, by the time the child born today is maybe 30 years old, the deficits we're talking about today, temporarily as enormous, will be normal normal, but rising in the future. So that's one choice. If you want to take that choice, I suggest you be very nice to the Chinese. The second possibility would be to say, well, let's bite the bullet and pay for all the things we promised, even though they're unsustainable. Let's just do it. Then you see the sort of level that taxes would have to be as a proportion of GDP. As you can see, the tax level literally goes off the chart. And it goes over 30% of GDP, or half as much again as we currently spend today. So that would be a choice. Let me just show you a little bit how that compares with current law. This is existing tax policy. This is actually the Obama administration's budget. This is the kind of argument we're talking about here. This is what they would have to go to, taxes, in order to balance the budget in the future if we didn't do anything on the entitlement spending side. But what does this mean? This is a percentage of GDP. That doesn't mean a lot to people. It doesn't mean a lot to people here or anywhere else around the country. What would this mean? If you were to raise tax rates on people to balance the budget without tackling the entitlement problem, what would those rates have to go to compared with today? Well, as you've seen, whoops, these are basically today's rates, 10%, 25, 35, or 35 for the corporate rate. Somebody born today, if you have a grandchild born today or this month, by the time your grandchild is 30, in their 30s, they would be paying these marginal tax rates, almost double. This is federal taxes only. You live in Maine. What's your rate of tax? 8.5%? Pay Medicare tax on top of that, maybe Social Security tax. You're talking about top tax rates of well over 70%, normal for your children and grandchildren. You may be comfortable with that. You may say, they fleeced me for all my time, my neighbor police, but that's actually what we're actually going to be talking about. Now, some people say, well, we shouldn't raise them that much, but we should raise them somewhat. Well, I just ask you a couple of questions about that. I don't agree with that, and let me just ask you a couple of questions and just to think about it. One is, do you think that we would be able to sustain the kind of economic growth we need in the future if we start raising taxes and marginal tax rates? You may argue either way. The other question, however, I'll ask you is this. If we were to send more money now to Washington, do you think they would spend it, or do you think they would save it for the future? You might want to think about that. But let me just point out, if you think about the healthcare debate right now, some people argue for tax increases and spending reductions. All the tax changes or increases that you'll hear about from others on this panel, and all the spending reductions that are being discussed, all of those today that will be discussed on this panel, are now being talked about as a partial down payment on an increase in entitlements, a new entitlement. So nobody is talking about reducing the long-term deficit in Washington with any new revenue. So just bear that in mind when you think about it. And I would put it to you, if you think that, if you're the kind of person here, man, who thinks that sending more money to Washington will be used in this way, you're probably the kind of person who thinks professional wrestling is real. Let me skip through to the last point. What could we do if we start to look at dealing with entitlements? I think there's a couple of very important things that we should be doing. First of all, let's fix the way we actually spend money. As others have said, we have certain programs on automatic pilot. We don't really have a budget. You know, the mega budget is basically, you go into the doctor in the hospital, they send the money in, and we guess what's that going to be in the future. It's like giving your teenager an American Express card and saying, go spend it wisely. What you do then is project what the bill is going to be. That's what we do in Medicare. It's not like any other area. So getting that, introducing a serious long-term measurement of how we actually put these things on the budget is very, very important. And showing the long-term obligation. We don't do that. Senator Collins doesn't have to sort of look in the annual budget process what the long-term fiscal situation is. It doesn't show up. She doesn't have to vote on that. People need to have to vote on that in order to get some sanity back into the process. Secondly, we've got to start to make our long-term entitlement programs, particularly our retirement program, fair but affordable. It's important to strengthen the basic guarantees for people, which are often fragmented. But I think that people who, quite frankly, can afford it should not get the same subsidy, the same benefit as people who can't. I don't think that Warren Buffett needs 75% of every one of his prescriptions paid for by other people in America. I think we need to introduce an income-related premium, income-related benefits for people. There's no other way, in my view, to be fair and yet to adjust. We've got to look at the retirement age. Basically, if somebody born today will experience about 1/3 of their entire adult life in retirement. We can't sustain that. We have to look at serious increases in the retirement age. And then finally, I would say that as we're doing this, it's very important to look at the other side of the coin. In order for people to deal with less entitlements from the government in the future, we've got to help people build up their own savings, those who can, in a much greater degree than we can. It's very important to look at things like automatic enrollment in 401k plans. There's very, very low savings rates in this country. And just making the default, they do take money out of your paycheck every month and put it into an account. You would see an enormous number of people beginning to save and don't save together. So we've got to do a lot of very specific things to build up people's capacity to sustain themselves in retirement. It's not an easy issue. There are going to be big debates over this, but it seems to me these are the choices that we have to think about. You have to think how you feel about that, and you have to tell Senator Collins. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Marshall. I'm happy to be joining the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, flocking with the Fiscal Hawk now for a second time. This is a bipartisan group. I guess I'm one of the Democrats. I can't speak for anybody else up there on the group. And I just have to note that on my two legs of this Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, I've been to Houston and Tennessee. There's a theme there. That's with George Bush at first. And I try to nothing sinister about it. The people here have been sympathetic to this Democratic themselves. But look, I'm really happy to lend my voice. I don't have a PowerPoint. I would be relieved or chagrined by that. But I think this is terribly important. That's why we're here on a gorgeous summer day to send the message. And the obvious question is why when everybody else in Washington is fixating about health care reform, are we here to talk about numbers and actuarial tables and budgets and CBO projections and all this exciting stuff? And the answer to me is that our swelling national debt is an urgent, a direct threat to this country's prosperity, to the well-being of our children, and to progressive government. That as a Democrat, means a lot to me, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a second. Our president is finishing up the first act of a two-act drama. The first act was to respond to the recession and the credit crisis that he inherited. Spent a lot of money to do that. That's why we're facing these large short-term budget deficits. I think that was the right thing to do. I think we staved off much worse problems by doing that. But it's compounded his difficulty as he now moves into Act 2 of this play, which is to restore the nation's long-term fiscal stability and soundness. That's just as important to the success of this president as dealing with the recession, dealing with the meltdown of our financial markets. Because if he can't find a way to reduce these accumulating debts, then nothing else he does is going to accumulate to a lasting legacy. This will be what his tenure will be remembered by. So it's a very difficult job. Think about it. You have to go out and tell the American people, we got to spend a whole lot of money right now. And a year from now when the economy, or we hope in a year from now when the economy turns up, we have to pivot and become very austere. We have to go from being bailout nation to thrift nation. And that's all of us. It's not just the government and the politicians. It's every household in America. So he's got a very difficult job to do, and I think we need to help him do it. We have no time to lose. I'm not going to recount all the stats you've seen here, but the thing I focus on is the tremendous run-up in the debt as a percentage of our gross national product. It's going up to 83% in about a decade, from about 40% in the last couple of years. Some projections even have us going up to 100% to like wartime levels. And what's happening here is that our country is on its way to becoming the mother of all banana republics. A country that is leveraged to the eyeballs, that is way too dependent on foreign lenders for its economic well-being, and that may find itself, even though we have all these advantages, including the reserve currency role of the dollar, but may find that international bankers will stop lending to us. And when that happens, this party is over. So I want to stress, what I think are four distinct dangers. It's hard sometimes to get our arms around what all these astronomical figures really mean, but they impose four huge costs on our society, and I just want to underscore them. Some of this will repeat, but I think it's worth repeating. The first is that spending in this way and borrowing in the way that we've done is a stealth tax on the next generation, my children, your children, Dave's grandchildren. And this turns the American dream on its head. We should be investing in our children in their productive capacity. Instead, what we're doing is imposing big debts, and they're really going to have to pay on them. And at the same time that we are in an automatic way, every year automatically spending for elderly folks grows. And so not only are we starving our own kids' future, but we are exacerbating the generational inequities that are baked into our public policy. And how can we, in good conscience, do that any longer? How can we look at our kids and know that is the effect we're having on them by our refusal to face up to the tough choices we're facing today? Secondly, it's a drag on our economic growth. We have to borrow every penny that we're going to spend. We're deep in deficit already for healthcare, for clean technology investment, for all the things we want to do and need to do as a nation. We have to borrow it all. That means we're going to siphon off more of our income, our tax revenue, to pay down interest on the national debt again, rather than investing that in the productive capacity of our people, our institutions, our businesses, our inventors. And that inevitably, inescapably means a smaller economy in the future and lower living standards for Americans, and probably, as Davis pointed out, growing foreign ownership of means of production in this country. Thirdly, we are giving foreign governments, not just foreign investors, but governments, inordinate leverage over our economic destiny as a country. Because Americans have low savings rates, we have to finance our deficits, as we've heard, increasingly by borrowing from abroad. And again, the Chinese leaders have already expressed this concern that the dollar may not be a stable store of value. If they stop buying treasury bills, if they start dumping dollars, or charging more to lend us money, we are in real trouble. As I say, the party will be over. The dollar could tank. We could see the interest rates domestically rise dramatically, and we would plunge the economy back into recession. The fourth point I want to make is this, that these cascading debts are paralyzing our government's ability to solve problems. It's paralyzing progressive government. As Dave's charts show, back in 1968, 2/3 of the federal budget was discretionary spending. That's things Congress voted up or down on year after year. This was the zone of democratic deliberation and choice. We're going to spend for this and tax for this and not that. That zone has been shrinking dramatically. It's now down to 39%. Mandatory spending that nobody makes any decisions about. It just gets bigger every year due to the aging of the population and the fact that people are living longer. That has grown from 28% of the budget to 50%, and that's what's on the verge of really taking off dramatically. So we do face a huge squeeze on progressive government. If you take the entitlements plus defense and interest on the national debt, they're going to absorb all the tax revenues by the end of what some of us hope will be President Obama's second term. That means there's going to be nothing left for education, research, transportation, housing, environmental protection, public safety, any kind of anti-poverty initiatives. All the things that as a decent society we should be investing in. Now, I realize that this is a story we brought here to you is pretty depressing. I sometimes feel like a prophet of pain. I don't really want to do that. It reminds me of a headline in my favorite satirical newspaper, The Onion, that read like this: "New government report shows cost of living now outweighs benefits." The picture is really not that bleak. This is an eminently preventable calamity if everybody does the right thing, if we can have a show of political courage and will And there's really no mystery, as Stuart has said, about what needs to be done. You know, President Obama is right. Reducing the unsustainable cost growth of healthcare costs is central to beginning to get a handle on our metastasizing Medicare and Medicaid costs. So this health reform is important not only in terms of covering everybody, but it's also an important down payment on the kind of fiscally constrained future we need to be building for our country. Secondly, we've got to fix Social Security. This is a tough argument for my fellow progressives. They're deeply in denial about this. Either they say that the argument that you need to fix it is a conservative plot to destroy the program, or they say it's an easy fix, we shouldn't worry about it. Well, if it's easy, we ought to fix it. We know what needs to be done, but we've got to start now. And this administration has said the right thing, but frankly hasn't done the kind of commission or whatever it's going to do to get cracking on fixing Social Security. And lastly, we have to overhaul the tax code. This is the hardest thing for my conservative friends to hear. The taxes in America have to be simpler, they have to be fair, and yes, they have to be higher to pay for the levels of government which we as a democratic society we've decided we want to provide for our people. We're not willing to cut those levels down dramatically, and I mean we have to slash the hell out of them. We're going to have to raise taxes. That's something we've all got to get our mind around. So finally, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there is a bipartisan plot to bankrupt America. Democrats are willing to raise money on rich people, but they won't cut spending. It's all sacrosanct. Republicans are willing to cut government spending, at least in theory. We didn't see much of it in the last decade. But they won't raise anybody's taxes. So we have a perfect storm of inertia, of inactivity. Nothing's happening, and our problems worsen. Now, it's easy to blame pusillanimous politicians for this, but it's too easy. These elected representatives are faithful barometers of what their constituents want most of the time. The problem is not them, it's us. If we're not ready to sacrifice, we can't expect our elected representatives to fall on their sword. So the last thing I want to leave you with is that if you really are serious about restoring fiscal responsibility, then we can't be sort of blaming people. This is not an exercise in fanning anger. It's taking responsibility to get all hands on deck and us putting pressure on our elected representatives to do things that are going to cost us and require us to sacrifice. Many thanks.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions now from the audience. If you have a question, put your hand up, and Rich and I will try to get to you.
My question is, at the Brookings Institute has a figure of the percentage of Americans who pay zero taxes as 43% of Americans paying zero taxes, federal income taxes. And this figure has been going up year after year after year. And how concerned are you about this fact? Because it's obviously the people who are paying no taxes are the ones who are demanding all these benefits that other people have to pay for.
Well, let me respond first. First of all, I think the second part of your premise that the only people who are asking for more are people who don't pay taxes is actually not correct. It's a lot of people who are at different levels in the income scale. Look at the Medicare drug legislation in 2003. That was not driven by poor people. That was driven by people who were quite long in this room. But your point is very well taken that when you have a society where almost the majority, in fact it could arguably by now be the majority, do not pay any federal income tax, you are asking for a problem of democracy, precisely the reason you mentioned. And I think that is a very worrying feature of the trend. Both parties are moving in that direction. I come from a sort of a family where a background is just, everybody should pay something, but that's a matter of citizenship. And I think as part of any tax reform, it's very, very important to revisit that issue. I think we made a terrible mistake. It doesn't mean that you take everything away from people or anything like that with a lower income, but the principle that you pay something, even if you get other things in return, is very, very important in any democracy.
You have to keep in mind that over half of Americans pay more money in payroll taxes than they pay in income taxes. And so you have to look at the total tax burden. At the same point in time, the payroll taxes aren't adequate to fund the benefits for those programs. And the people that are less well off benefit disproportionately, obviously, for those programs. What people may not realize is that the income taxes fund all the constitutional roles of government. Therefore, that means that the 40 roughly percent of people that don't pay income taxes now, headed to 50 under the 2010 budget proposal, get a free ride on the constitutional role of federal government. That needs to change.
I'm a former bank executive, and as such, like everybody in this room, I suppose, I've been appalled by the excesses that got us into the financial mess that we're in, which is, I think, interwoven with all that you've been talking about. And my observation is we've got a non-bank system that's unregulated, we've got a banking system that's unregulated or underregulated or ineffectively regulated. And I was optimistic when this whole thing hit the fan that something was finally going to be done about this regulation problem, but it seems to have stalled. And I just wonder what is going to be done, what should be done, and why isn't this a priority? Because the next big mess, I'm going to predict it right now, is reverse mortgages, which I've indicated to Senator Collins for well over a year is going to be the next big disaster that we taxpayers are going to pick up.
First of all, I think that Ann has raised a really important point. In part, the financial crisis that caused these huge financial bailouts was due to a failure of regulation. And I've actually introduced a bill way back in March that would create a systemic risk panel, a panel of regulators that could spot gaps in our regulatory structure that allowed, for example, for credit default swaps to be developed and to amount to trillions of dollars of risk to the system without anyone overseeing it. So, but you're absolutely right that there's very little progress on this issue. I'm a former bank regulator, financial regulator is more accurate. And thus, I feel this is really important, but when I talk to my colleagues, their eyes tend to glaze over when I talk about financial regulation. But the fact is, we have still not corrected the gaps in regulation that allowed the cascade of financial consequences to occur. And nothing has passed to prevent that from happening again. So I think this is extraordinarily important, and when you look at the billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that have been put into stabilizing the financial system, it is an outrage that the underlying weaknesses in regulation have not been corrected.
Maybe I could add a point to that, if I may, and that is that I think that one thing that has to be said very clearly is that the regulation and the enforcement and oversight of regulation by the Congress and by the administration has been abysmal, absolutely abysmal. And not only that, but certainly in the housing area, the congressional committees that deal with housing were pushing for years in both parties for mortgage companies and for lenders to keep on adding, to keep, looking aside from people's assets and income and so on. That was going on. So it's very important to recognize that. And that also that when you have regulation that isn't well enforced and isn't appropriately enforced, to just simply add more regulation, it doesn't get the crooks. The crooks always get around that. The people who are immoral get around that. It just keeps hampering more and more the honest people, the Main Street people who are trying to lend money to ordinary people. So we've got to be real careful that we don't respond to a failure of enforcement and oversight in particular, and gaps, by massive new regulation from the very same people who are not appropriately exercising oversight and control of existing laws.
Just add a little to that. The problem now, however, is we've created a too big to fail situation where very large institutions can engage in very risky policies and practices and feel that if the house of cards comes tumbling down, that Uncle Sam is going to be there to bail them out. And that is a very dangerous trend. So I think that that is a problem as well. But I agree totally that it was members of Congress that pushed, for example, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and lenders to lower their standards, all for the supposedly noble aspiration of encouraging home ownership. But putting people into mortgages that they cannot afford is not doing them any kind of favor.
First, thank you all for being here and welcome to Maine. Senator Collins, thank you for being here. I question with regard to, we seem to be spending money on health care for illegal aliens. Just a simple two-part question. Do you support that? And if not, is there anything you can do to stop spending our tax dollars to give illegal aliens free health care?
Well, first of all, let me say that there is a federal law that requires hospitals that participate in the Medicare program to treat anyone who appears who is in need of health care. I think that that is different from what you're talking about, which is whether the new bills in Congress are talking about extending health insurance coverage to people who are here in our country illegally. And I don't think those bills should extend coverage to people who are in our country illegally. When you talk about the 46 million uninsured Americans, or uninsured people, big difference, uninsured people in the United States, that figure does include millions of people who are not here legally.
Yes, Senator Collins, I'm concerned about the Fed, and it seems to me that the printing of money makes it easy for us to incur a lot of debt, and it makes it easy for things to get under control. So, you know, you mentioned the moral hazard just a few minutes ago, but I think, you know, this affects, you know, the quality of life. It affects, you know, my getting the black pill down the road, which I have to contribute to myself for my own funeral, and, you know, possibly for people that whose life is endangered because now we have a moral crisis. And I think, you know, our love of our Creator told us, you know, that our life is important, and I don't think the government should be fooling around with it. So I'd like to comment on that, please.
I'm not sure exactly what your question is, much as I appreciate your comment. I think it's on the role of the Federal Reserve. Is that correct? I just want to make sure.
Yes, the Federal Reserve, you know, that has the ability to print phony money. And so it's phony if Madoff does it, but it's okay if we do it. So, you know, I think we just have to get our priorities straight. So that affects our quality of life as well, because that makes my groceries higher every month. It makes my oil payments, but everybody else. So our income is not worth as much as it used to be.
We have two challenges right now that we need to keep our eye on the ball. We've been talking about fiscal policy, which is spending taxes that are determined by the Congress and the President. But Federal Reserve monetary policy is what you're touching on, and that's a very serious concern as well, because for those who follow the numbers, you'll see that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has more than doubled in the last year. And how do they do that? They print money, which is inflationary.
Now, in a time of a global recession, and with some of these unprecedented crises, you're not going to see inflation. But on the other hand, once we start turning the corner on the economy, once we start getting past these immediate crises, both monetary policy and fiscal policy needs to change dramatically. It's really not a pivot. It's a hard turn. And I have more of a confidence in the Fed doing that than I do with the Congress and the President doing that. But it is a legitimate issue. There is a concern there. And frankly, the Fed didn't do its job with regard to oversight and regulation of banks. I mean, they're not just in the monetary policy business. They're also in the regulatory and oversight business, and they failed at doing their job as well. And I think they need to be held to there needs some accountability there as well.
Question over here. Senator Collins, Dana Graham from Sydney, Maine. There are rumors that the Senate Finance Committee is considering a state-by-state co-op for people to purchase their health care. This insurance would be similar to what Maine has with Dirigo. How would the proposed differences be between Maine and Massachusetts?
Well, Dana, first of all, the Senate Finance Committee bill has not yet come out. As you know, Senator Snow is one of the 6 negotiators who is working on a bill, but Senator Ken Conrad has proposed the co-op model as an alternative to the so-called public plan, the Washington-run healthcare plan. I am not for the public plan, and I can go into that at great length if people want. So the question is, how would the co-op be structured? If the co-op is structured the way it's working very successfully in Washington State, for example, it can be a way for individuals and small businesses to band together so they increase their bargaining power and get a better price for their insurance. If, on the other hand, the co-op is going to be structured as a public plan by any other name and is subsidized by tax dollars, then I'm not for it. So the details are extremely important. And until the details are out, I'm not going to be able to tell which it is. I know I should not comment on a state program, but Dirigo does not strike me as a roaring success.
Including with members of Congress on specifically these kinds of issues, including the co-op idea. We have co-ops all over America. There are a lot of co-ops here in New England, of course. And what are they? They are organizations that are membership-owned, membership-controlled. They are not government institutions. There is a very strong case for saying that organizations like farm bureaus and credit unions and so forth ought to be able to go into the health insurance business to give people a new private option for health care. We can do that by making changes in federal tax law so that mutual insurance and non-profit co-ops can combine to actually offer true health plans. We can do that. That's simple, and it would only take a small measure. On the other hand, I come from a world where, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. When the proposals that are coming from Senator Conrad and Senator Schumer are basically not talking about what I just said or what Senator Collins has just said. They're talking about a federally chartered national co-op with a federal board run by probably a czar. To tell what the co-ops precisely want to do from Washington. And it will be federally funded. There is no difference between that and a public plan. And so be clear about that. We see a history of the proponents of the public plan trying to find some other name for it. And now they've latched onto the idea of co-ops, which are really great institutions, and then they want to create something totally different with a veneer called a co-op. So accept no substitutes. If you want cooperation,
Yes, Rick Stone, and I'm very concerned with the law of unintended consequences. And we recently just passed a major credit card overhaul. And 2 days ago, I didn't even know my Sears account was still open, but I got a letter from them increasing the rate to 25%. Now, I don't have any credit on that credit card, so I could call them and say, cancel my card. I don't ever want to do business with you again. But there's an example where we pass a law that we're going to try and help people, and we turn around and people who are carrying a credit balance are going to end up paying 25% interest on an annualized basis, and that's an increasing rate based on what interest rates do.
Let me just comment to say that I think that it's outrageous that you'd be able to charge that level of interest when inflation is zero. Outrageous. And I think that one of the problems that we have right now in this country is that both America and too many Americans are addicted to debt. And they're charging their credit cards, mortgaging the future, and frankly, this is a societal problem. It's not just the government. You know, Americans need to change their behavior too, and you shouldn't use a credit card as a financing mechanism.
I think this is a good opportunity for one of our experts to talk about what the impact on interest rates is going to be with this skyrocketing debt.
Well, what I was going to say first on that is that, you know, when we think about all the debt that we're taking on now, think about how very low interest rates are. So we've got like a national teaser rate right now that we're borrowing heavily on, and what's going to happen is the same thing that happened to the gentleman with the Sears card. At some point, when the economy recovers and picks up again, interest rates will go up, and our lenders will, mostly foreign lenders, will look at this and say, you're going to have to pay higher interest rates. Interest rates will go up naturally when the economy recovers, but also because we don't have a recovery plan. Now, think about when Detroit came to Washington, the automakers, and came and said, we need a bailout plan. What did Congress say back? Show us your sustainability plan. Show us how the money, you know, is going to be used and how you'll go forward. And I always took that as a very ironic thing, because at the same time, the federal government is running a policy that is itself unsustainable. So really what's going to happen is foreign lenders will say, show us your sustainability plan, and rates will go up. And that will have a dramatic effect on the budget. Interest cost to the federal government, which is of course a major expense to the taxpayer, could go up from around 170 billion today, as shown on that chart, to around 800 billion or so. And you know, that will take up, you know, I'm just throwing out about 4 times more of the federal budget than it does today, which obviously will squeeze out other programs, because that is the one truly mandatory part of the federal budget. We talk about Social Security, Medicare as mandatory programs, but of course Congress can change them. You can't do anything about your interest costs except default on the debt, which would be crazy. So we're going to would end up having to pay higher interest costs. That would put upward pressure on taxes and put a lot of pressure on the other parts of the budget. So we really do need to be careful. Just as the American consumers were lured in by low interest rates, the same thing is happening to us now, and we have to use this moment to learn from what happened to Wall Street.
Hi, Steve Griffin here. Question about, you've been talking about demographics and what's happening with the cost of healthcare. One of the critical things that I see out of all of this is home and community-based services. We spend 3 times as much of our Medicaid dollars on institutional services. Most people don't want to go to a nursing home or residential care. They'd like to stay in their home. I'm wondering if any of you can comment on, do we see that direction changing? Are we moving towards keeping folks in their homes in the community?
I think it's very, very important for us to look at ways of moving forward along the lines that you mentioned, to enable people to not just live in the best settings, but the most cost-effective settings as the age, and so on. one of the problems is that home-based care, and one of the reasons that it tends to be very expensive and it tends to run, cost is one of the largest growth areas, is it's very difficult to really monitor it as to what the expenses are, and so on. So that's one of the problems. But all that said, I think it's very, very important to give states especially a much greater opportunity to try ways of getting those, both the quality and the cost associated with these programs, these health programs improved. I've worked with members of Congress on both sides on legislation that would give states greater make changes in federal law to allow states to experiment more with outcomes being the measurement. If the state is successful in achieving better home-based care, for example, at lower cost, then they would be able to, they would be permitted to make changes in their programs to bring that forward. If other states try a different approach, good for them, and let's compare. It's very important, I think, and I think this is generally an issue with the healthcare system. Let's remember that the healthcare system in America is 1/6 of the economy. If it was a national economy by itself, it would be the 6th largest national economy in the world. The American healthcare economy is larger than the entire British economy. So we're going to try to change all this in Washington with 5 competing committees in the Congress and get it all right. Nobody's going to get hurt, right? And that's what we're actually doing. So I think in general, it's very important to say, let's allow, first of all, step-by-step changes, but also let's allow states to try things, to experiment, to see what works, and then compare. So we learn from each other. So Maine can learn from Oklahoma or from Minnesota and so on. And we can continue. It's a long answer to what you said, but the point is that to solve the problem you mentioned and to walk in that direction, you've got to allow a general ability to experiment at the state level and to compare. Federal government can be very good at sharing information, showing people, one state how the others work. This is how we've done welfare reform in America, by having the states experiment. So I think that is a critical stage in how we're going to solve this whole healthcare problem in a way that gets the kind of outcomes that you mentioned and get people in settings that they really prefer for their healthcare, particularly if they
I have a question.
If I could just add to that really quickly. The problem is that the Medicare reimbursements now are biased against home care. And that is a huge problem. It makes absolutely no sense at all that even as we speak, CMS, the agency that oversees Medicare, is proposing cuts in home health care reimbursements. I am a huge proponent of home health care. It not only is safer because people aren't getting hospital infections, it also is cost effective, and it's more compassionate in many cases because people would rather be in the security, comfort, and privacy of their own homes. And yet, our reimbursement system is biased against it. And on the point that was just raised, since the individual was very kind to bring me a bill on behalf of AARP that I've introduced with Jean Shaheen, we're now spending some $17 billion a year in unnecessary hospitalizations that occur within 30 days of discharge. These are hospitalizations that if the person had had some home health care visits after they were discharged, if there had been someone in charge of coordinating their care, making sure that the medication instructions were well understood, the repeat hospitalization would be avoided at a cost of $17 billion. In Maine, our rate of this unnecessary rehospitalization is lower than the national average. It's 18% in Maine. Nationally, the estimates are that it's about 1/3. So there are steps that we can take, and it goes back to the point that what we pay for makes a real difference.
To put things in perspective, $17 billion is a lot of money. It's 3.6 days worth of deficit.
But it all ends.
I don't know, it all adds up, but it's 3.6 days worth of deficit.
Hello, Michael Burke. Actually, I have two questions. One, there's been a lot of conversation here about the need to curb government spending. And I guess my question is, what are we doing today in Congress in terms of regulatory legislation, those kinds of things to actually move this process forward? I have another comment question. A lot of talk about the economy turning around. And if you look at it from a macro level, it seems that the only way we're going to do that is create jobs. And we all know that small businesses create jobs. I would say from my observation as a small business owner that the funds that we spend as a government have not gone to the small businesses. And so my question is, what are we going to do to move forward to help small businesses in terms of costs and in terms of being competitive and creating jobs that stay in the U.S. that help drive this economy and turn this economy around?
First of all, you're absolutely right about the role of small business. Small business still creates the vast majority of new jobs in not only the state of Maine, but the country as a whole. And that's why we should be supporting policies and tax reforms that are geared to helping our small businesses start up, grow, and prosper. And that's just not rhetoric. It's something that I personally have always worked for. What are we doing about spending right now? Well, there is a bill that David Walker mentioned that's been introduced by two of my colleagues that would create an independent commission to come up with a plan to address the entitlement spending that you've heard about, a plan to address the tax code, and then it would be submitted to the Senate and to the House for a straight up or down vote. Now, here's what I don't like about that proposal. I don't know whether many of you remember the BRAC proposal, the base closure and realignment. I know Kathy and several others who are local officials, state officials remember it painfully well. But that too relies on an outside commission to propose to Congress a take it or leave it choice. I am uneasy about outsourcing completely all the decisions to be made in such a fundamental area to a commission that is not really accountable to the public. I do think a commission could be very useful in identifying a path forward, in educating the public, in creating momentum, and in spelling out the hard choices. David and I talked yesterday that one possibility might be to have the commission report back to Congress with its plan and then allow Congress to alter the plan as long as the bottom line was the same. It was deficit neutral. I think that's a step in the right direction. I also think we need procedural controls in Congress. It used to be, as David and others will tell you, I think they expired in 2002, and look what's happened since 2002. But there used to be much stricter rules on the budget that helped to tamp down spending. And I think we need to put those rules back in place. And finally, there is interest in tackling these tough issues. I think it needs to be done sooner rather than later. One of the things that was mentioned is doing income-related means testing on some programs. When Part D for Medicare, the prescription drug benefit, was passed, I supported that. I think it made sense to have prescription drug coverage under Medicare, but I did vote to means testing. I did not prevail, but I did cast that vote. I will tell you that is a tough vote to cast. People don't come up to you and thank you for means testing a program or for voting to cut spending. And that's part of the problem, and I think that's why you go to the commission. Every day I meet with people who come to my office asking for more. And they're asking for more for very worthwhile programs that really do help people. Education programs, highway programs, transportation, veterans benefits. They're all very worthy causes. And it is very difficult to find a group of citizens who say, we know these are worthwhile causes, but we simply cannot put this burden of debt on the next generation. And that's why I think the work that you're doing is so important.
I think we have one last final quick question here for the panel.
Quick question. I don't know how long the answer will be. My name's Dan Tice, resident of FWUT Maine. I work at the Portsmouth shipyard. My question is there any specific plans or overall strategies being looked at to reduce or control the federal budget?
Well, I think Senator Collins was talking about the fact that in the 90s we had statutory budget controls that expired at the end of 2002. They need to be brought back. But they need to be tougher than the ones that were there in the 1990s because, frankly, we're in worse shape. And we need to not just be concerned with spending caps, especially spending caps, not just pay-as-you-go rules that make you pay for new spending programs or tax actions. But we also need to be concerned beyond 10 years because a lot of times games are played so you make it look like it's affordable and sustainable, but beyond 10 years the costs explode like Medicare prescription drugs. Frankly, I think the same thing is happening now in the current healthcare reform proposal. In addition to that, we also need to do something about the part of the budget that's the real problem. That's the 61% that grows on autopilot. We need to be able to subject that to some type of reconsideration and controls. Just as we need to do the $1 trillion a year that we lose in revenues because of tax deductions, exemptions, exclusions, and credits. That's totally out of control. It doesn't get looked at. It's a blank check too. And so there's a number of things that we have to do, and this commission, by the way, would address that as well, although I would argue you could do that without a commission, but to have it come into effect after the economy turns around, after we get past the immediate crises, because you don't want to have those kinds of constraints when you're in a recession.
I think all I would just add to that is I think that the healthcare debate could be a vehicle for making those kind of hard choices on the ultimate issue here, which is the healthcare costs, which would drive the federal budget over the cliff, really. And so the problem is that, as others have alluded to, more of it is we're using a lot of savings that could be used to improve the budget outlook. We're using them to expand the program. And so even if you're paying for it, which is a responsible thing to do, you're still treading water basically while you're about to go over the falls. And so I think that as the healthcare debate progresses, we really need to make it not just about expanding coverage, but about truly controlling costs. And just one caveat on that, it really is going to require some sacrifice. I mean, I'm very, very concerned about the trend of the debate right now where everybody wants to control costs and expand coverage. Nobody wants to do what you need to do, and it reminds me of the old saying that everybody wants to die. Excuse me, I was talking about death panels. The saying is everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And that's about what we've got with healthcare reform right now. We've got a vision, but every time a tough choice is raised, people say, well, no, we can't do that. And we're going to have to get over that mindset in order to truly bend that curve.
Thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for our panel, Senator Collins,